Kia ora tātou katoa. Today, the first day of the Christian year, we wait in anticipation. Not so much for the celebrations around a birth, but for the ability to reconnect with each other, albeit with restrictions. We wait not so much for the light that cometh into the world, but to lighten our isolation here and now. We wait not so much for Christmas Day, but for holidays and travel to beaches and other places of relaxation. It's been a long 3.5 months. Today is Advent Sunday, the first day of that preparatory season. A season not so much about buying presents and baking goodies, but for preparing in our hearts a room, as the old prayer says. A season not so much about bustle, hustle and tinsel, but about slowing, noticing, and replacing regret with gratitude. Above all, it's a season predating Christianity, of praying that the dark will be vanquished by the light, of hope arising again, even against the odds. The Bible has a lot to say about hope, often contradictory things. There are stories where hope is expressed by one's fertility, progeny, or lands. There are stories where hope is expressed by having a king, a great leader, or a Messiah. There are stories where hope is expressed as well-being for all the community, none left behind, as in good news for the poor, release for the captives, sight for the blind and the blinkered. Sometimes these stories don't sit comfortably with each other. In some biblical stories of hope, the audience don't hear what they expect. These are stories that are illogical, unconventional, that turn expectations downside up. Take Jeremiah, for example. It's one of those books in the Bible that I don't read all that often because I find it depressing. Woe betide you if you've been disobedient, and guess what? The evil empire, Babylon, is going to invade and deal to you. Jeremiah was not a popular preacher. He was a predictor of doom. Indeed, his preaching was so depressing that it landed him in prison. And sure enough, the evil empire came in 597 and took Jerusalem. Then there was a rebellion leading to a siege, the destruction of the city, and the exile of many of its leaders and people. Jeremiah lived through these horrific times of war, death, destruction, loss, and suffering. Out of a book of 51 chapters, you can find a few hopeful verses, like our first reading today, pointing to a time way in the future. The fact is, there wasn't much hope around in the 590s BCE. While Jeremiah was in prison, at a time when it was obvious to anyone that the Babylonians would triumph, at a time when it was obvious to anyone, particularly the people of Judah, that they'd be either killed or exiled, at this time, Jeremiah bought a field. Who in their right mind buys property in an enemy-occupied war zone? Jeremiah's cousin is the seller, and he clearly wants to cash out. Who wouldn't? Jeremiah decides to buy. Not because he thinks he will ever occupy that land or benefit from it. He's not buying it as an investment property. No, he buys it because he hopes for a future that he will never see. Like in the children's book I read this week, Oscar and Who Forever, Jeremiah dreams big enough to include even those who can't dream. Today, as we are besieged by many things, this COVID pandemic, obviously, and the shortcomings it has revealed and will reveal in our public health capacity, the changes in climate and the many knock-on consequences, the deterioration in living standards for many, and the rise in mental stress and jeopardy. Let us remember in these besieged times Jeremiah, and make investments for a future we cannot see and may never experience personally. Let us plant, buy, give up, one thing or many, to make long-term visionary investments. It was not until 539 BC that the exiles returned from Babylon, and by then Jeremiah was well and truly dead. He never saw that field, let alone profited from it. Jeremiah chose a path probably derided by the investment analysts of his day, a path that signaled his hope for the future. His was an unconventional, upside-down hope. Then there is the story of Naomi, some 500 plus years earlier than Jeremiah. She's a lead character in the book of Ruth, but doesn't get the naming rights, or a nice big window at the rear of St. Luke's church. Not that Naomi would have wanted those things. I guess she would have been happy knowing that her daughter-in-law, Ruth, is honoured and remembered. Naomi was a woman who travelled. She followed her husband, Elimelech, who, escaping famine, moved his family to the land of Moab, a foreign land, a land Israelites considered enemy. There Naomi raised 2 sons and saw them married. Everything was going swimmingly until it wasn't. The tide went out. Her husband died, then both her sons died, gone. Tragedy and suffering came to stay. Gone too was money, security, and the well-being they brought. There was no family around to provide minimal social security in Moab. Naomi's name had been Sweetness and Light, and now she renamed herself Mara, meaning bitter. Naomi symbolizes the story of so many who start life secure, positive, feeling blessed. Then something happens outside of their control, though they often irrationally blame themselves. It might be an assault, a death, bullying, a divorce, or a health event. Suddenly the security, the positivity, and the blessedness are gone, and their world goes to pieces. In the conventional story of this period, the expected solution to Naomi's problems would come in the form of a man arriving to marry her and solve her problems for her, giving her the security and blessedness of marriage. A male saviour would take her under his wing. Indeed, this is still a conventional fairy tale solution. But in our story, the solution is bizarre for the times. It comes in the form of a foreigner from the despised land of Moab, a widow with no financial resources, namely her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the unlikely saviour. By the end of the story, the end of the book, The chorus line is singing, Ruth is the equivalent of 7 sons. How can a poor foreign woman be the equivalent of 7 sons? Nobody believes that in a patriarchal culture, even in one like our own that pretends it isn't. Naomi's hope comes as a result of the loving fidelity of a needy outsider, one who said, one suffering woman to another, that I will go where you will go. Kindness and commitment. Kindness and commitment that was replicated in the acts of Boaz. This is unconventional, upside-down thinking. Then there is the story of a dreamy Joseph, from 500 plus years after Jeremiah, who is written up large in the Gospel of Matthew. This Gospel gets the dream of an angel, a big, unconventional, downside-up dream. The backstory that we all know so well is that Mary and Joseph are betrothed. The first step in the Judean matrimonial process, namely the exchange of consent. But they don't live together, which is code for saying they haven't had sexual intercourse. But Mary becomes pregnant. And this is a problem, a big problem. Just in case you think I think otherwise, I'm not theologically inclined to attribute Jesus' paternity to a non-human power. But whether Joseph was the dad, who knows? Regardless, Mary and Joseph had a problem. In that first century patriarchal world, the implication would be drawn that Mary had committed adultery, for which there is punishment. In a strict legal determination, she would be stoned to death. Until Joseph gets the big dream, he has no doubt that Mary has been unfaithful to him, but wants to find a way both to be faithful to the law and merciful to Mary. He doesn't want to see her dead. The part I find interesting is the dream. For we know that dreams arise from our subconscious processing. We also know that many men struggle with the notion of their wife or partner having had a sexual partner before them. We also know that many men struggle to be as loyal to their stepchildren as they are to their own children. It's also likely, in the case of Mary and Joseph, given the risky implications of continuing them with the marriage and with the pregnancy, that Joseph is in love with and deeply committed to Mary. All these feelings, currents, go into the subconscious blender of the dream world, with the result being Joseph changes his mind and defies both the law and the conventions of his day. Maybe that's why the story arose about leaving Nazareth for a while, getting away from the legalities. Mary, too, though we only know this from Luke's account, is also influenced by the dream world. She, too, is prepared to defy expectation. She sees, along with the narrators of these accounts, the pregnancy as a sign of hope. Hope not just for her and Joseph, but for Israel and for the whole known world. So there are two ways of reading this story. One way, the obvious way, sees a young unmarried girl in a land ruled by a foreign power, illegitimately pregnant by means of a consensual or non-consensual encounter. For this she will suffer, and along with her family, bear the shame and consequences of such adultery. The other way of seeing this, the less obvious way, indeed the upside down, downside up way, is that this pregnancy is a sign of hope in the midst of hopelessness. And Joseph's kindness and commitment is part of what makes it hopeful. All these three biblical examples, Jeremiah, Naomi, Joseph, talk about finding hope in the midst of hopelessness. One of them, Jeremiah, sees clearly the crisis coming, but irrationally uses his resources to buy a field he will never benefit from. An act of hope in the midst of hopelessness. One of them, Naomi, is in the midst of suffering, drained, but joins with her suffering daughter-in-law to together beat the odds and survive. Two poor women express their hope in fidelity, in kindness and commitment to each other. And one of them is Joseph, who dreams a dream, like the patriarch he's named after, that is big enough to defy society's laws, big enough to defy society's ridicule, and big enough to embrace Mary and their unborn child. And for that act of hope, he's been immortalized in crib scenes ever since. All these acts of kindness, commitment, and hope stand against what was considered conventional, rational, and wise. What are the acts of kindness, commitment, and hope we need to find and express in this day and time? And from me and from Cleo the cat, have a blessed week.